I stood completely frozen behind the frosted glass of the hospital corridor, where the cold, glaring fluorescent lights were ruthlessly illuminating the most bitter betrayal of my entire existence. My mother, with a face full of ice and contempt, was physically shoving me away from my own father's hospital door as if I were some kind of contagious disease that would contaminate their perfect family moment. I was 27 years old, a biomedical engineer named Angelina, and I was silently enduring excruciating physical pain from the extensive surgical incision hidden beneath my shirt after secretly donating my kidney to save his life. Through the window, I was forced to watch my father holding my sister's hand and weeping tears of gratitude praising her for supposedly sacrificing her own body to keep him from certain death. My mother then looked me dead in the eye, accusing me of being a selfish, cowardly person for refusing to even get tested for a match simply because I was terrified of a little pain or having a scar on my stomach. The brutal irony of her words was like a dagger twisting in my gut. Yet all I could manage to do was force a painful, bitter smile as the people I loved most in the world blindly worshipped a fraud while scorning their true savior. Then my mother's voice rose to a dramatic crescendo, a declaration of hate that echoed down the hallway. "You absolutely selfish woman! Are you so terrified of some discomfort that you would not even attempt to save your own father? Just get out of here because as of this moment, this house only has one true devoted daughter." If you are utterly stunned by that level of deception and cruel favoritism within a family and want to see the moment these lies are ruthlessly exposed, then make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion to this story. We are always curious to know where our incredible community is watching from, so please let us know in the comments below. 6 months before this medical tragedy struck our lives, our family gathered together in Boise to hear my father announce the devastating news regarding his failing health. We sat in the formal living room while the heavy silence was only broken by the sound of Dad, whom I usually called Walter in professional settings, but Dad at home struggling to explain his end-stage renal failure. He looked smaller than I remembered as he told us that he desperately needed a kidney transplant from a compatible family member to survive this crisis. My sister Tanya immediately shifted in her seat and began listing a dozen reasons why her fragile health made it impossible for her to even consider being a donor. Her husband, my brother-in-law named Damien, nodded aggressively in support, while claiming his demanding finance career required his constant presence without any medical interruptions. I watched them exchange quick, nervous glances as they effectively shut down any possibility of helping the man who had provided everything for them throughout their lives. While they were busy constructing their elaborate excuses, I quietly made an appointment with Dr. Miller to undergo the extensive compatibility testing required for such a serious procedure. I spent those following weeks sneaking away to the hospital during my lunch breaks because I did not want to trigger a family argument before I had concrete answers. When the results finally came back, Dr. Miller informed me that I was the only perfect match within the entire family tree who could safely undergo the surgery. I felt a strange mixture of terror and profound relief, knowing that I held the power to keep my father alive, despite his obvious favoritism toward my older sister. Instead of celebrating, I had to watch Tanya begin staging a deceptive performance by researching the recovery process to mimic various post-surgical symptoms for our parents. She would spend hours describing her supposed research on organ donation while subtly implying that she was the one secretly preparing for the sacrifice. I realized that if I wanted this surgery to happen without Damien interfering with the finances, I had to take complete control of the mounting medical costs myself. I quietly withdrew my entire life savings of $80,000 to prepay for the specialized tests and the complex surgical preparations without uttering a word to anyone. This was money I had intended to use for a down payment on my first home, yet seeing the fear in Walter's eyes made the choice feel remarkably simple. My mother, Rosemary, noticed my frequent absences from family dinners and interpreted my silence as a sign of cold indifference toward our family crisis. She stood in the kitchen one evening and publicly shamed me for requesting 2 weeks of vacation time from my engineering firm during such a dark period. Mom shouted that I was a heartless person for planning a vacation while Dad was fading away, never suspecting that those 14 days were actually for my own recovery from the surgery that would save him. Tanya sat at the table sipping her tea and watched me take the verbal abuse without saying a single word to defend my character or reveal the truth. I accepted the role of the family villain because protecting my father's dignity mattered more than my own reputation in that divided household. 3 weeks before the scheduled surgery date, Damien began executing a series of sophisticated and suspicious financial transactions under my father's name. He exploited Walter's deteriorating health and absolute trust to gain full access to his private stock accounts and retirement funds. While Dad was preoccupied with his medical battle, Damien was busy siphoning off large sums of money to cover his own mounting personal debts. I noticed the change in Damien's demeanor as he suddenly became much more attentive to Walter's paperwork while keeping me at a distance. He moved with a calculated speed that suggested he was trying to liquidate as much as possible before any legal eyes could intervene. During this same period, Tanya discovered the truth about my involvement when she found my signed organ donation consent forms. I had accidentally left the confirmation letter from the hospital in a folder within Walter's private study during my last visit. Instead of being moved by my sacrifice or feeling any sense of guilt, Tanya immediately went to Damien to discuss how they could steal the credit for themselves. They spent hours behind closed doors debating a plan to hire a corrupt nursing intern who could help them stage a fake recovery scene after the operation. Tanya wanted to ensure that the family saw her as the hero, while I remained the distant daughter who supposedly did nothing to help. Damien convinced her that they only needed a layer of gauze and a few complaints for Dad to hand over the entire inheritance of the villa to her. Rosemary fell for the manipulation completely because she was already predisposed to seeing Tanya as the devoted child. Mom decided to hand over the entire collection of family heirloom jewelry to Tanya as an early compensation for the upcoming surgery. I watched as Tanya accepted the diamonds with a tragic expression, pretending to be a brave martyr who was facing a dangerous medical procedure. Meanwhile, I discovered that a new credit card had been opened illegally under Dad's social security number. The billing address on the account was not our family home, but was instead linked directly to Tanya's private apartment. It became clear that they were not just stealing credit for the donation, but were actively draining my father's life savings while he was at his most vulnerable. I realized that I could not fight this battle alone without concrete evidence to present to the authorities later. My friend named Chloe, who works in digital security, offered to help me secretly install tracking software on the family banking accounts. Chloe spent several hours teaching me how to monitor the unauthorized fluctuations and download the transaction history without alerting Damien. We sat in my apartment reviewing the digital trail of theft that stretched back for several weeks across multiple accounts. My heart sank as I realized the extent of the betrayal, yet I knew I had to remain silent until the surgery was over for Walter's sake. Every day spent in that house felt like walking through a minefield where I had to pretend I knew nothing about their treacherous plans. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the surgery, I quietly entered the separate preparation area according to the identity confidentiality request I had negotiated with the hospital. I felt a heavy sense of isolation as the medical staff began the pre-operative procedures, while my family remained in a different wing of the building. Dr. Miller visited me briefly before the operation to provide a firm commitment that he would not disclose my identity to Rosemary or Walter without my explicit consent. The surgery lasted for 4 intense hours as the surgical team successfully removed my left kidney to prepare it for my father's transplant. I drifted into a deep sleep under the anesthesia while knowing that my silence was the only thing protecting the fragile peace within our household. While I was unconscious on the operating table, Tanya was busy executing her own theatrical performance in a completely different ward of St. Alphonsus Hospital. She appeared in a patient room, wearing standard hospital scrubs, with several layers of medical gauze wrapped tightly around her midsection to simulate a surgical wound. Tanya lay back on the pillows and closed her eyes to mimic a state of post-operative coma for the benefit of our mother. Rosemary sat by her side for hours while stroking her hand and praising her incredible bravery for saving Walter's life. The contrast was brutal because I eventually woke up in total solitude, with a sharp, agonizing pain radiating through my entire abdomen. There were no flowers or whispered words of encouragement in my recovery room because nobody even knew that I was currently a patient in the same facility. Tanya, meanwhile, was surrounded by expensive bouquets and a constant stream of relatives who were eager to applaud her fabricated sacrifice. Damien attempted to solidify their lie by sneaking into the medical records department with the intention of destroying the actual organ donation documents. He believed that he could easily wipe the digital trail of my contribution to ensure that the inheritance remained firmly within Tanya's reach. However, the advanced security protocols of the St. Alphonsus Hospital system immediately blocked his unauthorized access attempt and flagged his credentials. Damien retreated quickly to avoid being caught by the security guards, yet he remained confident that their visual deception would be enough to fool my parents. Rosemary spent most of the afternoon taking photos of Tanya lying on the hospital bed to post them immediately on her social media profiles. She wanted to build a public image of a daughter who had risked her own life for her family, while I was labeled the absentee child. Dr. Miller witnessed Tanya's elaborate charade when he did his rounds, yet he remained professionally silent as he had promised me earlier. I could see the profound indignation in his eyes as he watched her pretend to be in pain, while he knew exactly where the real organ had come from. Later that evening, Walter was wheeled into the room to see the woman he believed was his savior, and he wept with genuine gratitude. He reached out to squeeze her hand while his voice trembled with an emotion that broke my heart when I heard about it later. Walter looked at her and said, "Thank you, Tanya. I never expected the daughter I once thought was superficial to be the one willing to save this old life of mine." He had no idea that the biological miracle keeping him alive was currently struggling to breathe in a lonely room just 2 floors above him. 10 days after being discharged from the hospital, I sat in my darkened apartment and began printing out bank statements filled with shocking financial irregularities. The glowing screen of my laptop illuminated a trail of greed that was far more extensive than I had originally imagined during my recovery. I discovered that Damien had successfully drained $150,000 from Walter's primary savings account to invest in fraudulent offshore projects. He had moved the funds through a series of shell companies to hide his tracks, while my father was still struggling to take his first steps post-surgery. My hands trembled as I realized that Damien was effectively gambling with the money Walter had spent 40 years earning through honest labor. Tanya was equally complicit in this betrayal, as she used the stolen credit cards to fund a lifestyle of extreme luxury while Dad was still in a fragile state. I saw records of expensive first-class flights and designer handbags purchased at high-end boutiques in downtown Boise during the very week she was supposed to be recovering from her major surgery. It was nauseating to see her flaunting these items on social media, while pretending to be an exhausted donor who had sacrificed her physical health for her parents. While she was busy shopping, a massive hospital bill arrived at my door showing that Damien had intentionally ignored the critical post-operative payments. This negligence left Walter facing the immediate threat of a lawsuit from the medical facility, despite having more than enough money in his accounts to cover the costs. I knew that I needed a different kind of evidence to dismantle their elaborate theatrical performance before my mother gave away the rest of the family estate. I spent hours gathering official medical documentation regarding Tanya's actual blood type, which was clearly listed in her old records as type O. This scientific fact made it biologically impossible for her to have donated a kidney to Walter, since he possessed a rare type B blood profile. The cold reality of the medical reports was the final piece of the puzzle I needed to prove their entire narrative was a complete fabrication. Rosemary called me later that evening with a voice full of entitlement to demand that I submit an additional $500 every month. Mom claimed this money was necessary to pay for Tanya's specialized post-operative nutrition and expensive recovery treatments because of her heroic act. Chloe contacted me shortly after that phone call to provide a piece of evidence that was even more damaging than the financial spreadsheets. My friend sent over a high-definition video file showing Damien and Tanya laughing loudly at an upscale rooftop restaurant on the same day they told Mom they were going for a medical checkup. They were drinking champagne and celebrating their successful deception, while my father was at home struggling with basic mobility. I watched the video several times while feeling a cold resolve settle in my chest as I prepared for the final confrontation. Tanya's laughter in the recording sounded like a jagged blade against my nerves, because I knew exactly how much physical pain I was still enduring to keep Walter alive. I decided to confront her privately one last time before exposing the truth to our parents, because I wanted to see if there was any shred of humanity left in her. I met her at a quiet corner of a park, where she was still wearing a fake medical brace to maintain her public image of a victim. I looked her directly in the eye and told her, "You should stop this charade right now, Tanya. Our father's hard-earned money is not something for you and Damien to spend on those pathetic luxuries while he is facing a lawsuit." Tanya just laughed in my face and adjusted her brace while telling me that nobody would ever believe a bitter, jealous daughter like me over a celebrated hero like her. She walked away with a confident smirk, unaware that every single one of her crimes was now meticulously documented and ready for the world to see. At exactly 7 o'clock on the evening of the anniversary of my father's recovery, the villa in Boise was brilliantly lit for a party where I was an unwelcome guest. I walked through the front doors and immediately felt the heavy atmosphere of exclusion as our extended relatives gathered around the grand dining table. Walter stood at the head of the room with a glass of champagne looking stronger than he had in months, thanks to the organ I had quietly provided. He cleared his throat to get everyone's attention before announcing that he was officially transferring the title of the $2 million villa to Tanya. He claimed that this was the only way to repay the incredible sacrifice she had made to ensure his continued survival and health. Tanya stood beside him with a humble expression that masked the calculated greed I knew was hidden underneath her fake smile. Rosemary caught my eye from across the room and walked over to intercept me before I could even reach the buffet line. Mom told me in a sharp whisper that I was not permitted to touch any of the food on the table because I had contributed absolutely nothing to my father's recovery. She suggested that I should just stand in the corner and remain silent so I wouldn't ruin the sacred family moment with my supposed jealousy. Tanya noticed the interaction and immediately began clutching her abdomen in feigned agony the moment Walter looked in her direction. She leaned heavily against the mahogany table to remind him of the debt of gratitude he could never truly repay to his favorite daughter. It was a masterful performance that kept every person in the room focused on her imaginary pain, while I suffered through the real, physical ache of my healing incision. I remained calm while secretly activating the recording app on my phone as Damien approached me with a look of pure contempt. He began whispering a series of insults about how I was a useless burden to the Miller family who only showed up for free meals. Damien claimed that everyone already knew I was a coward who had run away when the family needed me most during the medical crisis. I kept the device steady in my pocket to capture every syllable of his arrogance while he continued to brag about their upcoming inheritance. The situation shifted suddenly when Dr. Miller appeared at the entrance of the living room after being invited as a guest of honor. Tanya's face turned a ghostly shade of white as she began to tremble with visible fear at the sight of the only man who knew the biological truth. She immediately tried to usher the doctor toward the patio under the pretense of wanting him to enjoy the fresh evening air away from the crowd. Tanya was desperate to keep him from speaking to Walter, but I knew that the time for silence had finally reached its absolute limit. I stood up in the middle of the celebratory dinner and asked for everyone's attention, while the room fell into a sudden, expectant silence. I looked at the relatives who had spent the last hour praising a fraud, while they looked at me with pity and disdain. My voice was steady and clear as I addressed the woman who had spent months living a lie at the expense of my own physical health. I looked directly at Rosemary and said, "Mom, you were actually right when you said there should only be one daughter in this house, but that person is certainly not the one who is deceiving both of you at this very moment." The confusion on Walter's face was replaced by a look of stern disapproval as he demanded to know what I was talking about in front of his friends. Tanya tried to interrupt me with a fake sob of pain, but I simply held up the medical blood reports I had brought in my purse. I pointed toward the doctor and challenged my sister to explain how an O-type donor could possibly save a B-type patient without causing a fatal reaction. The relatives began to whisper among themselves as the scientific reality of my statement began to sink into the room's tense atmosphere. Damien tried to snatch the papers from my hand, but I stepped back and prepared to reveal the digital evidence that would dismantle their lives forever. At 9 o'clock that evening, the luxurious atmosphere of the celebration was violently torn apart by the official medical files that I slammed down onto the dining table. The sound echoed through the silent room as I began presenting the blood test documents which proved that Tanya could never have been the donor due to a fundamental biological incompatibility. I spoke clearly to the stunned crowd of relatives about how my sister possessed type O blood, while Walter required a rare type B match to survive his surgery. Dr. Miller stepped forward to confirm my evidence while stating that the scar on Tanya's abdomen was merely a shallow cosmetic incision with absolutely no signs of internal organ intervention. The doctor's testimony hung in the air like a heavy weight as the guests realized they had been witnessing a meticulously staged performance for months. I decided that words alone were not enough to break through the years of favoritism and blindness that had clouded my parents' judgment. I calmly removed my outer jacket to reveal the long and authentic surgical incision that was still healing beneath my thin shirt. I then produced the detailed hospital invoices for $80,000, which clearly listed my name as the sole payer for the entire transplant procedure. I looked at the shocked faces of my family and told them, "This is my kidney currently sitting inside our father, and here is the bill that your supposedly devoted daughter used to justify buying her designer handbags." The silence in the room was absolute, as Walter stared at the physical proof of my sacrifice and the financial evidence of his favorite child's betrayal. I did not stop there because I wanted the entire truth of their financial crimes to be displayed for everyone to see. I used the remote to activate the living room television while projecting the digital evidence of Damien's identity theft and his various illegal offshore transfers. The screen showed a clear record of how he had systematically liquidated Walter's retirement accounts to pay off his own secret gambling debts. Damien tried to rush toward the television to unplug the cables, but several of our cousins blocked his path to ensure that the evidence remained visible. Walter watched the numbers and images with a look of profound horror as he realized he had chased away the daughter who saved him to worship a pair of common criminals. The weight of the deception finally seemed to break my mother's spirit as she looked back and forth between the fake bandages on Tanya and the real wound on my body. Rosemary began to weep, not out of joy for her husband's recovery, but from the sheer shame of her own cruelty toward me during the past few weeks. Tanya tried to maintain her lie by claiming that the documents were forged, yet her voice lacked any conviction as she realized the police were already at the front door. I had contacted the Boise Police Department earlier that afternoon to ensure that Damien would be held accountable for his massive financial fraud. 2 officers entered the house and immediately placed Damien under arrest, while they prepared to question Tanya regarding her extensive insurance scam and theft. The relatives who had spent the evening insulting me began to quietly slip out of the villa as the reality of the scandal became too much for them to handle. Walter sat down heavily in his chair while keeping his eyes fixed on the floor because he could not bring himself to look at the daughter he had treated so poorly. I watched as the police led Damien away in handcuffs, while Tanya followed them to the patrol car with a look of pure desperation on her face. My physical pain felt more intense than ever in that moment, but the heavy burden of the secret was finally lifted from my shoulders. I stood alone in the center of the room, while my parents sat in the ruins of their perfect family image, finally realizing the true cost of their blind devotion. 1 month after the shocking scandal that rocked Boise, the order within the Miller family was reestablished in the most ruthless yet fairest way possible. The legal system moved with a swift efficiency that left no room for the manipulation or lies that had previously dominated our household. Damien was sentenced to several years in federal prison after being convicted of identity theft and massive financial fraud against my father. Tanya managed to avoid an immediate prison sentence, but she was placed on strict probation and legally stripped of every single right to her inheritance. The luxury villa that she had plotted so hard to steal was now officially out of her reach forever as the court finalized the new ownership documents. I watched from a distance as the life they had carefully built on a foundation of betrayal completely crumbled under the weight of the truth. Walter and Rosemary spent their days in the quiet ruins of their home while trying to process the magnitude of their own failures as parents. My phone buzzed constantly with missed calls and desperate voice messages from Mom, who begged me to forgive her for her blindness. Both Walter and Rosemary were now pleading for me to return to Boise so that I could look after them during their difficult final years. They spoke of family values and blood ties, as if the last few months of targeted cruelty had never actually happened. I listened to one message where Walter's voice broke with genuine regret, yet I felt nothing but a cold sense of detachment from the man who had once been my hero. Their sudden realization of my worth was too little and far too late to mend the damage they had inflicted on my soul. I decided that the only way to truly heal was to physically and legally sever every connection that bound me to the Miller name. I went through the formal legal procedures to change my first and last name so that I could start a life that was entirely my own. I sold my small apartment in Boise and packed my remaining belongings into a few boxes before heading toward the airport. My destination was Boston, a city where nobody knew my history or the scar that I carried beneath my clothes as a reminder of my sacrifice. I felt a surge of strength with every mile that the plane traveled away from the toxic atmosphere of my former life. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the silent martyr who allowed herself to be stepped on for the sake of a false family peace. Before I left for good, I sent one final letter to Walter to provide him with the closure he was so desperately seeking from me. I attached the final receipt for the hospital bills I had paid in full, along with a brief note that declared my total independence. I stated clearly that I was cutting off all biological and emotional ties with them from this moment forward and requested that they never contact me again. I wanted him to see the exact cost of his life in dollars and cents so that he could never claim I had done nothing for him. The letter was not an act of anger, but a final settlement of a debt that had cost me my health and my trust in humanity. I dropped the envelope into the mailbox and walked away, without looking back at the street where I had grown up. Tanya was now forced to work long shifts at a local convenience store to pay back the massive debts she had accrued with her illegal credit cards. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had to sell all her designer handbags and jewelry just to keep up with her basic legal fees. Rosemary lived in a state of permanent regret in that old house, while the silence of the empty rooms reminded her of the daughter she had driven away. My mother was finally facing the reality that the hero she had worshipped was a fraud, while the child she had despised was the only one who truly cared. They were left with their memories and their guilt while I was moving toward a future that was full of potential and light. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Boston while looking down at the busy crowds of people moving through the city streets. For the first time in my entire life, I felt a profound sense of relief that was not weighed down by the heavy burden of family expectations. The cool Atlantic breeze felt like a fresh start as I realized that I was finally free to define myself on my own terms. I touched the faint line of the surgical scar on my side and smiled because it was no longer a mark of pain, but a symbol of my absolute freedom. I walked back inside my quiet home and closed the door on the past while looking forward to the quiet peace of my new beginning. Angelina's story has truly left me with an indescribable silence, and I believe many of you are feeling the exact same way right now. Before we say goodbye to today's video, I really want us to stay a little longer to look deeper into what she had to sacrifice. Don't scroll away just yet, because these next few insights might help you redefine the two words, family ties, in a much more realistic way. It is heartbreaking to witness a devoted daughter like Angelina being pushed to the brink by her parents' blind favoritism. In my opinion, kindness, if not accompanied by alertness, can sometimes become the perfect bait for selfish and manipulative individuals like Tanya or Damien. The ultimate lesson to be drawn here is this: family is supposed to be a peaceful sanctuary, but if that sanctuary has become toxic and riddled with lies, then cutting ties completely is not a cruel act. It is the only way to save your own life. Sacrifice only holds true value when it is given to those who know how to cherish it and are truly worthy of it. I sincerely thank you for listening to this story until the very end. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep building this channel. If you were in Angelina's shoes, would you have the courage to secretly donate a kidney and then decisively leave your family forever as she did? Or would you choose a different, fairer way to handle it for yourself? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really looking forward to reading and discussing them with all of you.